Hello, my friends. Welcome back. I have a story for you today, a winter's tale, and a very old piece of folklore from Scotland. So that is why I'm wearing my tartan trousers today and having a nice wee dram of whiskey. And tonight's story is called The Piper's Ghost, or The Cow That Ate the Piper. Let's go. Long ago, but not so long ago, there was in the lowlands of Scotland a tinker. A tinker is it's a word for a gypsy, but literally it's a profession for someone who makes or mends pots and pans and odds and sods. It's a typical traveller's profession because you can do it on the road. And this lad, whose name was, I don't know, let's call him Jack, Jack the lad, who was a tinker, and he was also a piper, a bagpiper, this lad. So in the summer, back in the old days, times were good, you know. There were a lot of weddings outdoors, a lot of parties. People were happy because the sun was out, and Jack would always have a place to lay his head in exchange for his music. It was said of Jack and people like that they had music in their fingertips, but no money in their pocket. But Jack didn't mind, you know, because wherever he went, so skilled was he on the pipes, the doors would just open for him, and he would always have a place to lay his head in a pub or tavern or ale house or a farm or croft or private house, wherever it was. But in the winter, times were harder, you know, people weren't gathering outdoors so much, people were just staying inside. He earned a little bit of money, you know, as a tinker, mending pots and pans, but times were tough. And also then, as now, there was often discrimination against travelling people, against gypsies. So one night it was snowing and Jack was on the outskirts of some town somewhere, and some young youths coming back from the pub decided to, take down the pegs of his tent and just boot him on the road. So that night, with snow pouring out of the sky, Jack set off on a long, lonely road to find somewhere else to lay his head, with all his worldly possessions on his back, mainly his tools of the trade, his tinker's tools, his saws and his knives and his hammers and his nails, and also, of course, his bagpipes. He had them all stacked on his back like a snail. And off he went along the road across the high peat moors, hoping that he would find somewhere that would take him in. And the snow was falling thicker and thicker and thicker, blanketing the land, and he could barely see in front of him. And Jack's walking along, and his boots have holes in them, and snow is going right through the flap in the toe and chilling his toes to the bone. And then he's trudging through the snow, and to make matters even worse, Jack trips up over a log and lands face first in the snow. And the snow goes all up through and under his shirt and in his eyebrows and in his mouth, and he's just frozen to the bone. But you know, Jack, he's a good lad at heart, was Jack. And he thinks, well, I don't want any other lonely traveller along this road like me to trip over this log that's fallen across the road. I'm going to move it. So Jack got down and he tried to move that log, but it was just frozen stiff to the ground, and his hand slipped. And he looked down at that log, at the black bark of that log, or what he thought was bark, and there he saw a button, a gold button. Brass, I should say. So Jack brushed off a little more snow from this log, and there was another button, and another, and he brushed off some more snow, and then he suddenly started back in fear, because there was a frozen face. Because as you've probably guessed, my friends, this was no log, this was a corpse, frozen stiff. Some poor old soul had perhaps fallen off his horse, or his horse had bolted and he'd been knocked unconscious and been frozen to death here. Or perhaps something darker, perhaps he had been murdered. But anyway, Jack didn't wait around to find out. But he thought what he would do was just brushed some small snow off this corpse, and he saw this body had a brand new pair of leather boots lined with fur. They were lovely. And Jack looked down at his old rotten boots with holes in them, and he thought, they're not going to do him any good anymore. So he got out his hacksaw from his pack, one of his tinker's tools, and quick as he could, he began to saw away at the frozen legs of this unfortunate body. And he sawed, and finally he had one foot off, and then he sawed, sawed the other foot off, and then he had two brand new pairs of boots, although unfortunately the frozen feet were still inside them, and he thought, I can thaw them out later, he thought to himself. I apologise throughout this story for my very, very terrible and stereotypical Scottish accent, if I have any viewers in Scotland. Anyway, what Jack did was he tied the bootlaces of them boots together and hung him round his neck, and off he went, feeling just a little bit better. And Jack's mood improved when he just passed a bend in that lonely road, and he saw on the hillside there was a little light just swimming away in the blackness of the night. It was a little farmstead, or as they say in that part of the world, a croft, just a tiny little farm cottage with a few little farm buildings around. And that was the only light in sight. So, thanking the various divinities, he set off wading through the snow with his pack on his back towards that light, just hoping, praying that inside would be a friendly host. And eventually he got to the door of that little croft, and he was shivering cold, and he could see light was spilling out from around the cracks onto the snow and spilling out through a window on the side. And he thought to himself, I'll just have a little wee peek in there first of all, just to see what I'm dealing with. So Jack crept around to the side of the house and peered through this little window, and what a sight did he behold on this winter's night. It was such a nice domestic scene. There was a little cooking stove with an old woman, a farmer's wife, bent over some stew, and he always fancied he could smell the aroma of this rich Scotch broth coming through the panes of glass. And then he looked over in the corner of the room, and there were some chairs by a fire, nice fire burning away, and there was an old man, he had a nice bottle of Talisker Sky there that he was sipping away on. He was just drinking that whiskey and warming his toes by the fire. And Jack, he was thinking, I'll get a little bite to eat, some soup, maybe a crust of bread, maybe they'll even be kind enough to give me a wee dram of whiskey. So, rubbing his hands together in anticipation, Jack went to the door and knock. Knocked. There was no answer. So he knocked again. Still no answer. Then he was just about to knock a third time, and suddenly the door opens, and a bitter, bent old man is stood there and says, "What do you want? Get away from here! I don't like gypsies," or something to that effect. And Jack was just about to say, he had hidden those frozen boots behind his back, obviously, and he was just about to say, "I'm a piper, I'm Jack, I would like to play for you to lay my head somewhere." But there was such a torrent of inhospitability, and the door was slammed in his face. And he knocked again, and the door opened, and he said, "Can I please just have somewhere to stay?" And "There's no room in the house!" And he closed the door again. And Jack was very, very despondent, but he wasn't about to give up. The third time he knocked on the door, just thinking, what was he going to say? And this time it was the farmer's wife that answered. And she looked a bit cross as well, to be honest. But maybe Jack thought that he just saw a little twinkle of compassion in her eye. And she just jutted one finger towards the cow barn that was just a little way over the farmyard, and said, "You can sleep in there." But she said, "Be careful of the cow. Daisy, let's call her. She's a big beast, and she likes to bite." And with that, she handed Jack just a tiny little crust of stale bread. That's it. And slammed the door. Well, so much for the hospitality shown to strangers. That's usually a very good Scottish custom, but clearly not everywhere. But anyway, Jack liked to look on the bright side of things, and he took his little crust of bread and waded through the snow and squeezed through the door of that barn. And it was barely warmer inside the barn than outside it. And sure enough, there at one end of the barn, Jack saw this great, huge cow, this massive Highland cow, fattest cow you've ever seen in your life, and it was just staring straight ahead and just chewing the cud, just. And Jack sort of approached this cow, and he could feel the heat coming off that cow. So he thought, I've found a place to thaw my new boots. So he put the boots underneath that cow and let them thaw, and then he just sort of crawled into the loft, into the hay, and munched on his bit of bread and just drifted into a sleep. And then he woke up in the dawn morning. The farmer's wife would surely be down to milk the cow shortly. So Jack quickly got up. He was going to make himself scarce. He didn't want to be, shooed out of there. And then he got his boots, and he found that they were perfectly thawed. And those dead man's feet just slipped straight out of them. And he slipped his own feet inside those new boots, and they were just perfect. And Jack looked up at that cow. And he remembered the warning of the farmer's wife, of the old woman. Be careful, that cow bites. And then Jack had a little idea. He put the dead man's feet inside his own old, worn-out gypsy shoes and put them just underneath that cow's head that was chewing away. And then, hearing the farmer's wife coming down and the rattle of the milk bucket, he crept away and hid inside the hay, chuckling to himself, and made a little spy hole to see. And that farmer's wife came in and looked at the cow, looked around, saw no one was there, looked down at the boots that had been severed, bone sticking out of them, and she screamed and ran up to the house and said, "Husband, husband, the cow has eaten the piper!" And then the farmer came. What do you mean, you stupid woman? And he came down and he looked at the cow, looked at the feet, looked at the cow, looked at the feet, looked at the cow, looked at the feet, looked at the cow, looked around, and then he went, "Oh my God, shut quiet! We need to bury them! Quiet, tell nobody!" And he got those feet and went out to the vegetable patch behind the cottage and just dug a hole in the snow and threw the boots into them and then covered them over again and then shooed his wife into the house, slammed the door, put the latch over, and all the curtains just shut. And Jack was just pissing himself with laughter. And she had also dropped the bucket of milk, the pail of milk, the farmer's wife. So we had a nice drink of fresh, warm, lovely, unpasteurized, creamy milk. Delicious. And then Jack had another little idea. He waited. And he just started to tune up his bagpipes, just quietly in that hayloft. And that farmer and his wife, they were shut within their little croft. They weren't coming out. They were spooked by what they'd done. They'd killed a man indirectly via the means of livestock. Now, just when Jack was just looking up at the sky, and he could read weather quite well. And sure enough, just as he had suspected, a fine dusting of snow began to fall just around dusk. Obviously, it gets dark very, very early in the winter in Scotland. And it was just starting to become dust, that gloaming light, that's strange and purpley. And then Jack took his bagpipes and he went and stood in the garden behind that cottage on the very spot where the farmer had buried the dead man's feet. And he stood there and just waited till a fine dusting of snow had sort of covered his whole body. So he looked for all the world like he was entirely covered in white, like a spirit. And then he began to play the bagpipes, the most beautiful, sorrowful, haunting tunes he could think of. It was, I am told, I wasn't there, but I'm told it was the best performance that Jack had ever given in his life. Haunting. And before long, just as he had suspected, the curtains of that little window twitched open, and the farmer and his wife peered out both together, heads on top of each other, and then they saw the ghost of the piper, and they screamed. They unbolted the door, and they ran through the snowy night, all the way down the mountain towards the nearest town, many, many, many miles away. They were not coming back soon. And Jack just laughed and laughed and laughed at his cleverness and his fortune. They had left the door of the house wide open, and feeling that they had been rather inhospitable before, I've had too much whiskey, he strode right into their cottage. He helped himself to a nice bowl of soup. He poured himself a nice whiskey. He put his feet up by the fire and let his new boots just sort of dry out, and the steam was rising off his shins. He had a full belly, he had a full bottle of whiskey, he had a roaring fire. It was wonderful. All he wanted now was someone just to, share a few tales with, a few stories, just like we're doing now together. And just when he thought that, there was a dunk, 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 a knock at the door. And Jack went, how delightful, a visitor, likely some wanderer just like me. And he opened the door, and sure enough, there was there a quite short man with a dusting of snow all over him, of course. And Jack said, traveller, a weary traveller, come in, come in, come in. Put your feet up by the fire. And that little man said, I would do, if I had any. So that, my friends, is the story of the piper's ghost, or the cow that ate the piper. So that story was first told to me by a storyteller called Ben Haggerty. And Ben Haggerty was told that story by a Scottish, tinker and piper called Willy McPhee. And Willy McPhee, he's dead now, sadly, but he's part of an old generation of sort of gypsy storytellers. And he told that story to Ben in the first person, saying it had happened to me. I think that was probably... I don't think that's true. This is a sort of old folklore. We find this story in lots of parts of Britain, England, and Scotland, and Wales, and also in Ireland. So it definitely didn't happen to Willy. But I really admire that I guess almost trickster-like seizing of the story and making it about you. That's a very good. That's a traveller skill. That in other versions of this story. The character's called Jack, which is what I called him in this story. Jack is sort of a go-to everyman name in a lot of Scottish and English folklore. It's sort of he's sort of an everyman. He's sort of you and me, but there's something of the trickster in Jack. If you're interested in the archetype of the trickster, it's a very common one throughout the world. I've made a playlist on my YouTube channel called Trickster Makes This World, with a whole load of trickster tales. In Native American folklore, think like Coyote and Raven and Wolverine. In Europe, there's like Mr. Fox. In Africa, there's like a Nancy. But in sort of English and Scottish folklore, there's this character called Jack. Think Jack and the Beanstalk. He's often outwitting and tricking much bigger or stronger adversaries and getting one over on people, but is also very, very stupid sometimes as well, and propelled by kind of greed and desire. It's a very interesting archetype. Essentially, I think the trickster is kind of in all of us, and that's why these Jack stories are just so wonderful, in my opinion. So yeah, a bit of a Jack story there, a traveller story from Lowlands, Scotland. Yeah. Thank you very much for watching, guys. That was the little winter's tale for you, and I'll see you again soon.